now approaching London King's Cross, where this service terminates. Change here for onward connections to London Underground and international services from St Pancras.
Please note, on LNER services, train doors will close 2 minutes prior to departure.
Welcome to episode 46 of the Cycling Europe podcast. My name is Andrew Sykes and welcome to London. You might have guessed that from what you've just heard. I arrived at King's Cross about half an hour ago and I'm making my way down to the West End, down to Covent Garden to meet somebody, well, rather special. I'll tell you who in a second. Now, this podcast, it's been going for 3 or 4 years and I reckon we've had some pretty big hitters in the cycling world. We've interviewed Mark Beaumont. We've interviewed the current CEO of Cycling UK, Sarah Mitchell, YouTuber Ryan Van Duzer, quite a few authors, Steve Silk, Simon Parker, and the doctor who cycled, well, he spent 4 years cycling around the world. That's Stephen Phibbs. In fact, I met him and chatted to him not too far away from here a couple of years ago. Then there's been lots of unsung heroes, people like Anne Lowther, who hails from my corner of the world, and perhaps my favourite, Timmy Mallet, probably because I grew up in the 1980s watching him on TV, and he told us all about his journey on an e-bike from southern England all the way to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. Lots of you will have heard of most of those people, not all of them. I reckon everybody listening to this is probably going to have heard of the person I'm speaking to today. His name is Tim Moore, and he's written, well, more than a dozen, I think, travel books. Many of them have been about cycles that he's embarked upon here in Europe. And I'm meeting him down in Covent Garden. The reason why I've chosen Covent Garden is because I'm meeting him at the London Transport Museum. Tim is famous for embarking on his various journeys, both on a bike and off a bike, on curious forms of transport. So it seemed fitting that the London Transport Museum was the best place to meet him.
Andrew, hello.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you very much for agreeing to make it a bit later. My wife sort of said... hello, I'm Tim Moore, travel writer and accidental cyclo-tourist. I've sort of ended up doing a lot of books about riding around generally on quite inappropriate bicycles across Europe in the main.
Right, well, my first question was going to be, are you a cyclist?
Well, I always feel a little bit exposed by that because you are a cyclist, Andrew, and I always feel that I'm kind of not really, purely because in between my over-ambitious cycling adventures, I don't really do very much cycling. And I've got a whole roster of excuses why that's the case. I live in London and it's not very nice cycling in London, which is kind of true. I don't know, actually, that's it, isn't it? That's the excuse I've got. That's not very good. But the other one is that, yeah, I've convinced myself that the only way to retain my excitement about setting off on a big mission is by leaving enough time since I last did any real cycling that it seems like a novelty. So it's like, right, here we go again. And that does work, I must say. Every time on the first day, it's almost like kind of, wow, look, I'm setting off on a big bike ride. I've never done this before. And then after about 3 miles, I realised that maybe I should have done something in terms of physical preparation, really.
When you were a kid, presumably you had a bike and presumably you cycled when you were a kid?
Well, absolutely, and I think that's part of the reason. Certainly, when I did French Revolutions, which is my first sort of bike-based book, was because there was the contrast between this extraordinary sporting event with this monstrous physical challenge, but doing something that everyone can do, and everyone can ride a bike, and it's a universal experience. And yeah, I used to ride a bike to school every day. I probably, thinking back, I must have clocked up a few thousand miles doing that, because it was about sort of 5 miles each way, and I did it a lot. and yeah, it just it became a sort of urban conveyance. When I was a teenager, I used to use it a lot before I could drive and things. But then I think it's fair to say from about the age of 19 to about the age of 35, I didn't really do any cycling at all.
Well, that's interesting, because I didn't have a car until I was 30, and I think that was a really useful thing, because it wasn't, I wasn't, it was just simply circumstances meant I didn't have a car, so I was always using a bike, and I'm really glad I did that when I was younger, because I'm not sure whether now I would ever leap into becoming a cyclist, having not done it in those kind of early years of adulthood.
Yeah, I think exactly. I think that is kind of crucial in a way. But I think what kind of reignited the flame of interest was when they started showing the Tour de France on telly when I was a student, really. So it came on after the highlights on Channel 4 came on after Countdown. So that was obviously standard student fare. So I just started watching it and got completely drawn in. And like I said, there was this. These are elite sportsmen, but they're just doing this thing that I can do. I mean, I can do that. That bit where they're just rolling along, I could easily do that. Maybe when they're going up this massive hill, I can't really easily do that. But I didn't know that until I attempted to do it later on.
Well, I was actually going to ask you about being a student, because you were a student in Sheffield. Did you ever head into the Peak Districts in the Peak District on a bike?
Yeah, almost every day. No, I never, literally never. I don't think I ever rode a bike in Sheffield. I was there at a very interesting time, actually. It was just at the kind of probably the low point of Sheffield's existence. So it was very sort of post-industrial, and I used to walk into all my lectures through just literally the demolished remains of massive factories. But I also did have cars, so I used to drive around a bit. I think the thing is then it was much cheaper to have cars and much easier to have cars, and there was much less traffic and parking was easier. So these days, I'm sure exactly, none of my kids who are now really quite old, they don't have cars, and they do ride bikes more than I did when I was that age, probably.
Now, there's a story about your grandfather, and talk about him and his role in actually getting you into not the cycling, but the travelling bug. Yeah, well,
my grandfather was a journalist for the Daily Telegraph, and he was a foreign correspondent, really, and he was a serious traveller. He spoke. I mean, he was completely self-taught. He never went to university or anything. He taught himself to speak about 8 languages, literally, kind of Greek, Russian, French, Italian, Spanish, German, the whole shebang. And he got into journalism, and I think he was the first sort of Western journalist who went into Stalin's Russia, and I think he became quite a big name. There's this sort of apocryphal family story that his name was on the side of buses in the 1920s when he did this big series of articles back from Stalin's Russia. But yeah, and even after he retired in the mid-60s, he just used to spend his entire life travelling, and it wasn't, he had a real phobia, I guess, which may have been to do with the fact that he was in Singapore when it was being evacuated just before the Japanese came in, and the last plane out crashed and everyone died, and he didn't get on it by some sort of mistake. So after that he thought, I'm never ever going to get on the plane. So when he into his 60s, 70s, 80s, he would go off on banana boats across the Atlantic, or he drove a Land Rover to India and back when he was in his mid-70s. So he was an inveterate traveller, but he was very down on the idea of just holidays. So his inheritance, he was still alive, but he gave all of his grandchildren 3,000 quid each, and they said that you have to spend. So it's like a travel bursary. You can't go on holiday, you can't go and buy yourself a car or something. You've got to go on an enormous journey of some sort. So this was in 1990. So my girlfriend and I got this sort of clapped out old Saab and spent 3 and a bit months driving around Eastern Europe, and and it worked up as a significant time. Just the Berlin Wall had just come down, the Iron Curtain was no more, so it was a very, very, very interesting and slightly alarming in some ways, because the whole infrastructure had just kind of collapsed, and all these old Soviet-run style campsites were just abandoned. But we just sort of rocked up and kind of broke into little chalets and slept in and things like that. But and that also spawned my first ever bit of travel writing, that trip. So I owe it all to him.
And obviously that trip down the into the, or beyond the Iron Curtain as it then was, actually that's quite important when you came to write the book later about cycling the EuroVelo 13.
Yeah, it was. There was a lot of compare and contrast, just because I had that kind of legacy of this previous trip when I'd been through loads of those places, and seeing them, it felt much more real to me, like the whole Cold War era, because of what I'd experienced in seeing just the sort of tail end of it in 1990. And it made it much easier for me to relate to all these, what to my children, for instance, would seem as just ancient history, these old, kind of Soviet monuments that are just still strewn around all over the place. But it was. I did draw on that quite a lot. I think it gave me not an affection, but certainly some sort of strange nostalgia for the whole Cold War period, which clearly, speaking as we are today, isn't quite so nostalgic.
Yeah. But did you actually write about that first journey back in 1990?
I did. That was my first. It was my first ever travel story. I mean, looking back, I just have led a charmed life in that regard. So I went on this big trip that my granddad, basically bankrolled, came back and, just sort of thought, well, it seems like that was quite an adventure. And I'd taken a few photographs, so I just sent them off to the Independent, which happened to be the paper that my family used to kind of get through the letterbox every day. And they said, "Oh, yeah, that's quite nice. Yeah, we'll run that." And they ran it, and they used some of my photos. And then about 3 days later, I got a letter came through the letterbox from a publisher saying, like, "Well, we quite like that. Would you like to write a book?" I have to say there was a gigantic hiatus at that point, because I then started kind of having children and starting a family, and it seemed as if going away on travel book adventures was a bit self-indulgent, because it didn't seem like it was probably a very good way of making a living.
But it wasn't until your third book that you wrote about the Tour de France, so did it take some persuading to do something on a bike?
Well, I did it again, kind of accidentally. In the first book I did, I was retracing the sort of Icelandic journey of this eccentric Victorian aristocrat who attempted to, at one leg of his journey, to ride a horse across Iceland, and he actually didn't get very far, because the interior of Iceland, as I know, being married to an Icelander and having been there several dozen times, is incredibly inhospitable, and you don't want to do that on a horse. But I thought, well, okay, I'm not going to ride a horse because I'm terrified of any animal larger than a cat, really. So, I rode a bike. So I did actually ride a bike, and my in-laws, because they know I'm a bit of a hopeless idiot, insisted on sending their youngest son to accompany me. So me and my brother-in-law went and rode across the Icelandic interior. And it was, I think, because to sustain myself, because it was actually really quite scary. I mean, lots of tourists go to Iceland now, but this is in 1998, I suppose, and it was pretty, nobody really went there. And, we were in the middle of nowhere, no mobile phones or anything, literally on this sort of gravel track, and having to carry our bikes over our head through kind of glacial streams. And the thing that sustained me was just all of these commentaries that I'd built up from having watched the Tour de France for the previous few years. And so I just sort of, used to go sort of full Phil Liggett, and, while I was chasing my brother-in-law down those lone breakaways and things. And I think I must have written about that aspect of it in the book. And then an editor from another publishing company said, "Oh, well, I noticed you wrote a bit about cycling, and what about going off and riding the route of the Tour de France?" It's a shame, really. I'd like to it to be my idea, but it wasn't actually my idea. It was somebody else's idea. But she said, because I met her a few times, and she obviously assessed my physical wherewithal and said, "All right, well, obviously it's stupid for you to try and attempt to ride the whole thing. So why don't you just do little representative bits? Just go and do one of those like long flat stages with the sunflowers that you always see in the pictures of in the papers, and then do like a mountain and do one of the time trials, and so." It was slightly regrettable that I started off with the intent that I wouldn't be riding the whole thing. So the very first thing I did, having also established from my research that cheating was absolutely part of the Tour de France from day one, year one, when the guy who won it supposedly did large numbers of the stages in a train. So I thought, well, that's okay then. Cheating isn't the great tradition of the Tour de France. So, you know what? Well, I'm starting off in kind of the middle-ish of France, and the first thing this route does, it goes up. I think it was a tribute to Bernardino, basically, because he was from Normandy, and they wanted to go. So there's a great big northern loop all the way up through Normandy, which was A, into the wind, B, quite hilly, and C, in the wrong direction as far as I was concerned. So I just snipped off 600 kilometres, and then fundamentally did do the entire rest of the rest of the tour. So I did 2,000 odd kilometres, but I can never say that I rode the whole route because I didn't.
Well, which year did you choose? Because to begin with, the Tour de France, I've got a book at home, and it's got the route every year, and for the first, 20, 30, 40 years, the route's pretty similar, and it does kind of go all the way around France, and then they started to change it, and I think, to try and visit as many places as possible. So what route did you take?
Well, it was the year 2000. I think it was Lance Armstrong's first victory, or maybe his second. I think they still sort of do this thing where it's clockwise one year and anti-clockwise the next. But these days it's much more bitty, and they have little bits, and then they get on a bus or even a plane and go. But I think it was one of the last properly traditional tours that it was almost a continuous thing. So
actually, you were doing the Tour de France from the year that you were actually cycling.
Yeah, well, exactly, and it was really funny because I set off in. Well, it was in early May, so the tour was starting in just a few weeks' time. But the French, in their very French way, they just didn't want to reveal the route, even though they must have known the exact route for ages, and they wouldn't tell me. I got in touch with the Tour de France press office, who seemed to take great delight in basically being incredibly unhelpful. So I guess it was probably quite a good time to do it because it was before the internet. Really, there was nothing like that. You couldn't. Well, the internet was around, but it was very, very basic. You couldn't find stuff out, and people didn't know that. All they knew was, well, this stage 3 starts at Futuroscope and ends at Limoges or whatever. So I knew where each stage started and ended, but in between that I would just be having to make it up as I went along, and I was literally going into the town hall or going into bars and saying well, that was the thing, exactly, straight away. What a hideous error! I didn't use the right gender. I would say La Tour de France, which means the Tower of France.
You don't think they cottoned on to the fact that this English bloke was about to actually work out a route, and they thought, well, we're going to wait for him to do it, and we'll just follow whatever he did, and when we do it with the professional guys.
Well, I think they obviously, again, it was weird because these days it seems that lots of people do what I did then, and it's a very common thing for just people to set off and ride the route of the tour. But nobody was doing it then at all, and all these old guys in these cafes where I'd stop and ask for directions or like kind of quadruple espresso, and I would try and explain to them what I was doing. They just thought I was completely nuts. They'd never heard the like. And it's funny because it wasn't that long ago. It was 22 years ago, but in that space of time, the whole concept of going off on individual massive cycling journeys has just changed out of all recognition, and then it was a really, really niche, weird thing to be doing, and now it's very commonplace.
Yeah. I did read the book at the time, by the way. I've just completely forgotten the details. Did the publishers get the book that they were expecting, or did they get a book that they weren't expecting?
Well, you probably have to ask them that. I'm not. I do know that they obviously it was for a division of what is now Penguin Random House, which is obviously a massive publisher, called Yellow Jersey. So they were a sporting imprint, but until that point, they'd basically done quite traditional sporting books that were, biographies of cricketers and all that kind of thing. I think they also actually did have the rights to Lance Armstrong's. It's Not About the Bike. But yeah, so obviously my book wasn't. Although it's funny. I still laugh seeing it in the sort of sporting section in bookshops. It's not really a sport book, not really a travel book either. So it was, I suspect, a fair bit sillier than they were expecting. I don't know, but they did seem very happy with it, and I think it was quite handy really for the Rachel Cagnoni, who was my editor, because it sort of transcended the usual idea of what a sport book was in some ways. That's making it sound That sounds a little bit flash, doesn't it? But because it was anyway, I think it brought new people into that kind of market, and it was useful for her because she just set up this yellow jersey imprint, and suddenly it was like, look, you see, it's not just 7 people who want to read about Alan Border, the Australian wicketkeeper or something. Maybe loads more people. I think what it was, I think I just completely accidentally tapped into the latent middle-aged men in lycra mammal phenomenon before people were necessarily doing it en masse. People of my kind of age, going off on big bike journeys, but they might have been thinking about it. I'm sure a lot of that was to do with the Tour de France being shown on telly in this country, but I think I was just inadvertently ahead of the curve.
Do your publishers kind of yelp for joy when you produce a bike book, and kind of go and hide when you produce something which isn't on a bike? Do they prefer bike books, or do they prefer the other stuff?
Well, I think I think to the extent of knowing as a hard fact that they kind of indulge me by allowing me to do non-bike books, and then say, well, the thing is, let's look at some sales figures, Tim, and you will see that your books about bikes do better. And I mean, it could be. I'm perfectly happy to do that because if I did it, every single book was a bike book, I probably would get a bit bored with it. So it's quite nice, as I said earlier, to come back and do another great big bike journey, feeling fresh and excited, as if I'm ready for a new challenge. It doesn't feel like I'm, dog returns to his vomit kind of a situation. I'm quite enthused by this. But yes, from a commercial perspective, there is always a kind of, yeah, that's great. So when I look back at some of the things actually they did allow me to write about that were really pretty terrible ideas and probably not very good books and commercially fairly disastrous, like writing a book about everyone who scored 0 points at the Eurovision Song Contest. I'm amazed at how indulgent they were. They let me do anything that wasn't about cycling.
Because you've written French Revolutions, Geronimo. Have I pronounced that right?
I think so. Well, it's not even a real word, so you can pronounce it how you like, really.
Geronimo, the cyclist who went out in the cold, and the newest one, Vuelta Skelter. Now, when I saw Vuelta Skelter for the first time, I kind of almost punched the air, thinking, God, Tim must have somebody at his publishers who gets paid good money to come up with these names, because they're all cracking names for bike books. I mean, I remember when I was cycling my routes, and after having done the first one, and I knew the second one I was going to write a book, and the third one, it played on my mind a heck of a lot what I was going to call these books, and I came up with some really prosaic titles at the end of the day. But where did your titles come from?
Well, it's kind of a shame in a way, because it is. I'd like to say, oh well, yeah, but I never ever have an idea of the title, and like you, I find it quite. It's a real ordeal. Something. Oh my God, what am I going to call this book? French Revolutions, which that has. It felt like I did think of that on my own after I came home, and I thought, okay, that's quite snappy. That's quite good, even though it does mean to this day that when I look on the Amazon chart, for instance, it's always number 1 in French history because But yeah, that was. But I thought I was surprised to an extent that no one had used that. I'm sure they probably had used it, because that's the sort of title you can imagine on some newspaper story, like a headline about some resume of the Tour de France. But Geronimo, we really agonised over that. My editor at the time, I wanted to call it the extremely long, difficult, horrible, something other like a bicycle race. And he wrote some blog about what a ridiculous idea that was, and how he had an author who thought that was an okay idea for a title. It kind of made it in as the subtitle, some variation of that. The thing is, I suppose, I'm a bit. Thank you very much for saying you think they're really great titles. I always slightly think Geronimo needs a bit of explanation, because I'm saying, well, it's like the Giro, so it's like Giro, Geronimo, like Geronimo. No, it's like I don't know.
Well, so does Vuelta Skelter.
Vuelta Skelter does, and Vuelta Skelter actually, in some ways, the title did come first. And again, it wasn't really my idea. I think somebody actually came up to me at a sort of book festival type thing, and said, "Oh, Tim, why don't you write a book about the Vuelta, because you could call it Vuelta Skelter." And I did think, again, it sounds like it may have been, I'm sure somebody must have used that before, but it just acquired a momentum, and the publisher said, "Oh yeah, that's great. We'll go with that." As it turned out, the content matter, which was significantly more somber, I would say, than the other books about cycling I've done, never, in some ways, sits slightly uneasily with this jaunty title. But there we go.
What's your style in terms of the cycling? Come back to the books in a second, but in terms of preparing the cycles, in terms of the daily routine, in terms of physical preparation, route finding, that kind of thing, accommodation, is it all? Well, I think I know the answer. I don't think it is booked in advance, but can you explain the thought processes that go into actually planning these rides?
Thought process just in itself seems like that's giving me too much credit. And again, I'm using it as an excuse for the fact that it's all a bit shambolic, because, well, my books are a bit shambolic, so I need things to go. They can't. If it was all too well organised, it wouldn't be. Nothing interesting would happen. So that's my excuse for not really doing any planning at all, or much in the way of physical preparation, which is just. I just find it. It seems like I've convinced myself that it's cheating to prepare too well, and fun things don't happen if you're over prepared. I mean, okay, clearly I do. I mean, for instance, in this most recent book, Vuelta Scale, so I needed to know the precise route of the 1941 Vuelta, the Tour of Spain, and because the Vuelta has not been very well documented, unlike the Tour de France or even the Giro. There's only been one book written about the whole Vuelta. I mean, that was actually in English, a very, very useful for me history of the entire event. Not even no one in Spain has ever written a book just about that, about the kind of their national tour. So there was certainly no kind of here's the route of that race. So I did have to spend ages, and because I don't really speak Spanish at all, going onto online newspaper archives and just scrolling through these things and finding just they didn't have any maps. It was just you'd find at the end of that day's results, okay, and the next stage is from here and it goes through these towns, and then I before I went, I did spend, because it was during lockdown, I had a lot of time on my hands, I did actually map out the entire route in what I felt was sort of forensic detail in advance, and I was really pleased with myself, and I put it into this route planning app. I was going to do it on Strava, but I sort of joined Strava, and then immediately I had all these emails from people saying like, so and so is now following you on Strava. I thought, oh my god, what did I do? So I thought, well, I'm not doing that, forget it. So I binned Strava and got this thing called Komoot, which seemed pretty good. Without wanting to necessarily offer too much in the way of spoilers, I just made a very stupid mistake, and so 2/3 of it, despite my weeks I'd spent really forensically planning the route, I didn't select the correct mode, and so spent a lot of time going up kind of goat tracks and things, because I'd set it to be hiking rather than cycling. Okay. What a complete idiot. So that made my life very difficult. So, but yeah, I mean, it's probably the same way that you might do. When I start off in the morning on it, when I'm actually out there on the road, I have an idea. You sort of have an idea. Okay, if I want to do, maybe you never really want to do less than 100 kilometres, because that's just bad for morale. So you say, well, I can do 120, 130. Whereabouts might that take me? Oh, okay, I'll probably get to about there, so that's what I'll aim for. And if suddenly you make really fantastic progress, or more likely you make really, really crap progress, you have to recalibrate. So I tend to, it was this time. I've very rarely actually been turned away thinking about it, and there's no room at the inn. I always, in the end, it seems to be okay. And you do find somewhere to stay. I know you do loads of camping and stuff, which I'm just too lazy to do that, because it just seems like you have to carry all this really heavy stuff, and I just can't face it.
Yeah, but you're right about not being turned away. And nowadays with things like Booking.com and what have you,
I've certainly have. I do generally do a bit of that when it comes to about an hour and a half before where I'm going to stay. I will fire up a few of those sorts of apps and at least see if there is likely to be availability. yeah, so that's what qualifies as military grade planning in my book.
Now, the one that I actually listened to it when I was walking to work over the course of, well, last half term, so from through January, and that's the Cyclist who went out into the cold. And you follow the route of the EuroVelo 13, the Iron Curtain Trail. That must have been a godsend in terms of route finding. Was it as you expected it to be, or was it a bit more work in progress?
Well, I'm not even sure. That, I mean, without wanting to the EuroVelo whole thing is amazing, and I could see when I got into the areas of Europe where there were lots of EV paths crossing each other with all these lovely signposts, thinking like, wow, what a great network. Well done to the European Cycling Federation. But I mean, the reason I did EV13, the Iron Curtain Trail, was because it was brand new, and basically no one had done it.
Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. I know, I'm sorry.
No one had done it, and when I got in touch with them, they said, "Well, actually, yeah, that would be great. If you do it, could you tell us how long it is? Because we're not quite sure." And I literally, I think they had said to me that they thought it was, I can't remember the numbers now. Either way, it turned out to be about 1,000 kilometres more than they had told me it was, or I think maybe more than that. It was really quite a lot further, to the point that if I had known that it was basically 9,000 kilometres before setting off, I might have thought twice about it. It was very, very far, and I didn't see a single sign saying you are on EV13 or any suggestion that I was on the Iron Curtain Trail. I think it was in Estonia, so I'd done at least a couple of thousand, probably more like 3,000 kilometres by that point. But then, realistically, I don't know what I expected. I think maybe in my mind's eye, I thought I'd be going down through Finland on this lovely empty bike path with "Welcome to EV13" signs, but why would they? I mean, Finland is a very, very large, very, very, very empty country, and it would be folly really to expect that they would lay out this special path and put these signs up. So yeah, they didn't. Luckily, there's only about one road in the whole of Finland anyway, so I wasn't really going to get lost in a hurry.
Yeah, I remember the first one I did was the number 5, from basically London down to southern Italy. And I remember finding I'd never heard of these EuroVelos before, and I thought, wow, all my prayers have been answered. And only to find out that, when I set off, that, oh, well, it's a line and a map. And people still contact me now, asking me for detailed directions or a GPS track, and I said, well, I didn't have one. I just kind of made it up. I could see it on the big map of Europe, and I basically just made the whole thing up. Although it did piggyback on regional routes that you could follow more easily, and I actually quite like that. I don't think I'd ever want it to be a case that all of these things are like motorways and you just never kind of get lost, or I think there's an element of kind of fun and adventure in there if it's not perfect.
Oh, completely. Yeah, it would have been really tedious from my perspective if there'd been kind of a big picture of a bike sprayed on the road with EV13 every 150 metres. That would have been silly. It is. When I got to I remember crossing the Danube, and that obviously is a big EV kind of crossroads, and seeing all these signs and kind of finger posts with EVs number whatever this way and that way and this way, and feeling slightly envious of the people that were doing that, not least because they had been cycling along a river and it would have been really flat all the time. But yeah, no, it was absolutely part of and I did feel a little bit of a pioneer doing this route as pretty much the first person to do it. Certainly the first person to do it. I did discover that some team of Germans on a fleet of electric bicycles had done it as a kind of publicity venture, but obviously that's just cheating in every single way imaginable. So I'm not quite sure why I handicapped myself quite so dramatically by doing it on this.
Well, I was going to say, you mentioned bikes, because clearly what makes your cycles a little bit different, to say the least, is the bikes that you've chosen. Even for French Revolutions, was that on an antique bike?
No, French Revolutions, exactly. I started off very sensibly, and just I because I didn't know anything about what I was doing, I just sought expert advice and asked people, okay, I'm a complete idiot and I'm going to try and do this big bike ride. What do I need to take? and what bike should I get? So actually, I kind of, it was GT Bicycles, like an actual real bike firm, gave me a very nice deal on a GT ZR 3000. Was it ZR2? The ZR 3000, which was a brand new, spanking new bike. And I remember I was so unaccustomed to actual real bikes that it had. I'd never even seen or heard of a bike that had. The gear levers were also the brake levers. You press, and so I remember phoning the guy up and saying, "I'm sorry, there's no gears on this bike. What's going on?" He said, "No, you dumbo, they're on the." Oh, right. So that was a brand new, really nice, brand new bike, and I think by the standards of the time, probably. I mean, this was before the super manual era where you could spend like 20 grand on a bike. I think it was about 800 quid, but it was a very nice bike. Then after that, I guess I just slowly got drawn into the idea of having a sort of a period authentic, or at least some bike that fitted the character of what I was doing. And I guess that bike did, because it was a 2000 bike, and I was doing the 2000 Tour de France. So when I did the 1914 Giro d'Italia, I thought, well, you know what, maybe I should try and do it on a 1914 bike. And I was quite amazed to discover, even though I made various balls ups, and it was a few full starts finding a 1914 bike. It wasn't in the end that difficult to find a bike that was, very nearly 198 years old. And I suppose people don't really throw bikes away, do they? Because a bike is always, because as we were saying earlier, it's always part of everyone's upbringing, everyone's like kind of backstory. And it's because when you get given a bike when you're a kid, it's a really big present, and it's an heirloom, and you keep it. And they don't really, I think maybe bikes are now a bit more disposable, but certainly in those days people kept bikes. So I got this ancient museum piece, and looking back, I can't believe that I effectively pretty much I did ask people who knew what they're doing for a bit of assistance, but lots of it I just sort of built this bike on my own, and got all these rusty old bits and kind of left them in vats of citric acid and put them in my oven to dry them off and all this stuff, and somehow it kind of, well, I mean, when I say it held, it did, it didn't break in half, but loads of bits of it fell off all the time, and particularly the brakes were the worst thing. I mean, the brakes, looking back again, it does seem, I think there must be some point in your life when you there's a sort of tipping point when you think, okay, there's a point when you've got enough life left ahead of you that you think, I shouldn't take stupid risks. And maybe I was just before that point, and I thought, well, this is not really irresponsible of me to go off on this bike up gigantic mountains and come down them, which basically doesn't really have any way of slowing down, because the brakes were they were obviously 100 years old anyway, and made out of, and the first time I attempted I thought better test them out to do an emergency stop, all the calipers just buckled in half. And the brake blocks had wooden rim wheels, and I remember buying these, because obviously the actual wooden rim wheels on the bike I bought were completely riddled with woodworm and warped, and I was amazed to find this firm in Italy that still produced wooden rims for bicycles, and handmade, the lovely things. So I got a set of these wheels, and I actually assembled them myself and put I can't believe why did I think I could do this, building a wheel with spokes and stuff. I mean, no wonder I had some issues in that department. But I remember, so these wheels arrived, and I emailed these Italians, said, okay, well, they're great, they look really nice. What kind of brake blocks do you recommend? And he said, well, why? I said, well, because I'm going to ride. He said, no one rides. You're not going to ride on there. No one rides. That's for display purposes. You get your nice old bike and put it on the wall of your office. So he said, well, you can't use rubber, because they didn't use rubber in those days, because the wood gets really hot and the rubber will just get melted. I said, well, what do I use? Well, use cork. So, there were, I think actually some track bikes, bizarrely, do have cork pads, but they were not, I needed the old style blocks, and no one made them. So
you did just kind of get a few bottles of Jacob's Creek and...
that's exactly what I did do. Yeah, I did. I had to make my own brake blocks out of I discovered actually on the road. So I had a few that I carved up in advance, but they didn't last very long. They never really wore down so much. They did get a bit singed and burnt, but they just got really hard and brittle and just fell out. So Prosecco corks were by far the best, because they were really, really hard. But they didn't, fundamentally, even though they kind of didn't burn, they also didn't work. So they had almost no effect on my speed, and it was terrifying regularly.
You see, I admit I cannot fathom your thinking here, because I know obviously it makes a good story at the end of the day, but when I was cycling on the last long trip in 2015, the same time as actually you were cycling from top of Finland down to the end of the Iron Curtain Trail, I was heading in the other direction, and we did exchange tweets at the time. Don't know if you remember, but we did.
I do remember that. We almost crossed paths, didn't we?
Yeah, well, a few hundred miles away, I think.
Well, no, this is as good as a mile.
But I had a slight little tick. It went tick tick tick, and it turned out to be in the rear hub, and it started in about just south of Bordeaux, and it finally got diagnosed and repaired when I was staying with some friends in Hamburg, and it drove me nuts, absolutely nuts. Now your bikes, I mean, they must make all these kind of noises as a matter of course, and that would seriously have me in crying by the side of the road every single day.
I must say that is really true, isn't it? It's the noises that really do your head in on these things. I think because you are on your own all day, and quite often, generally, as I'm sure it's the same for you, you are on your own in very quiet surroundings. So every noise and creak and squeak your bike is making makes itself very, very, very apparent. And it did. I mean, I fully aware of that. It drove me to the brink of insanity, this bike, with the noise it made. I remember trying to describe these sounds when I was writing it up afterwards, because of course I made all these voice recordings in the saddle. I'm using my phone. That's what I do these days, rather than stopping and scribbling things in a notebook. And you can hear in the background all these things, like this sort of chorus of funny little. And I think I remember being very frustrated. But how did I not? Literally, why didn't my brain just dribble out of my ears? Because it just drives you berserk. And on a bike like that, there's nothing really you can do about a funny noise in the end. You can just sort of, kind of basically give it a bit of a kick, or because I would quite often take this bike because I must say, of all the countries I've been around, Italy was the country that had the most affinity with old bikes and old bike racing and that kind of thing. And everyone, they was, clearly like, oh, Fausto Coppi, they would all give me all this, like they were. But then when I actually went into a bike shop and said, look, there's something wrong with my bike here, they would, a couple of times I found a couple of really nice blokes who did spend hours and hours and hours trying to make my bike better. But usually they'd just say, well, what do you expect? Look at it, it's like 98 years old, just get out of it, I'm not having anything to do with that. And miraculously somehow, I think on the rear wheel by the end, I think I'd 4 spokes were missing. And the wheel was warped so badly that it was rubbing out. I think I'd more or less taken the brake blocks, just given up on them by that point, so they didn't really have any effect on my speed. But it was hitting the side of the frame on both sides every single revolution on the last few days. But I suppose when you think I'm near enough, you kind of blot out some of those sensory inputs when you think, oh, I'm gonna make it now. But yeah, it is the noises, and I suppose because I strongly suspect that you are much better at fixing bikes than I am. So you might think, oh, I can do something about this. Because I fundamentally am totally aware of the fact that I can't do anything about it, I think, well, I better just live with it then.
No, I'm not. I'm terrible, and I'm a bit like a typical man in terms of his health. I just don't look at it. I try and not inspect anything, just to make sure that I don't find anything that's wrong, because that will then really worry me. But the 2 bikes that you use, the 2 antique bikes for the Giro d'Italia and the Vuelta, at least they were made for cycling long distances when they were actually built. That wasn't the case with the East German shopping trolley. Now, I mean, listening and reading that first part of the book when you go through Finland, I mean, you're having a hell of a time. That's pretty clear, but it's difficult to feel sympathy for you, because, well, you kind of you're the master of your own disaster here.
Yeah, that is so right. It is exactly. It's difficult to feel. There were times in those first few days when I really, really wanted to feel sorry for myself, and I'm sure I did. But at the same time, there wasn't a little background voice. There was a great screaming voice in my head that said, "Well, what do you bloody expect, you idiot?" I remember before I went off on that thing, I I spent some time with Michael Hutchinson, who was a real cyclist, who's represented his country and did a book about trying to kind of break the hour record on that kind of thing. And he said to me, he said, "Are you really going to ride that bike down all that way?" He said, "So the first unfrozen lake you get to, you're going to chuck it in, and you'll never." And so I think exactly. I think it's because I'm not a real cyclist, because I don't do gigantic amounts of cycling in between these books. I sort of hadn't really taken on board what a stupid idea it was to take this obviously inappropriate machine with tiny 20-inch wheels. I cheated to the extent that it was an open frame little shopping bike, and even I, with my stunted knowledge of physics and so on, I looked at it and I thought, if I put all of my panniers on the back and I'm sitting on it for 9,000 kilometres, this bike is just going to break in half. So I did have a little sort of crossbar fitted to support the frame. That was as far as my modifications went. Oh, actually, that's not. I did also, because obviously it didn't have any gears, and I did find, which I justified in a kind of hands across the Berlin Wall type way, this West German shopping bike of similar vintage, which had this. I mean, it's really clever. I don't know how on earth it works actually. It's a 2-speed internal hub thing, and if you sort of kick back on the pedals, it goes to the other. I mean, there's not a massive amount of difference. It's like at times I would struggle to tell the difference between these two gears, but clearly it was exactly 100% better than having one gear, so it was something. But I think if I had done any proper preparation, or I had done much more cycling, I would never ever have considered doing that. And it was a bit annoying, as you say, that I couldn't feel more sorry for myself, because I mean, I think the whole of Finland, I averaged something like 9.5 kilometres an hour. I laminated a map of the EV13 route, and I took it along, and I thought, that'll be a nice little thing I'll do in the evenings. I'll just get my marker pen out and plot my progress. And even after a week, I couldn't even really do like a dot. It was an A4 laminate. I couldn't even actually do the tip of this pen on how little I'd covered. The thing is, obviously, as you will be aware, when you set off on a massive bike ride, it's always, when the first week or so, you think like, my God, this is a long way. I'm never going to do it. But on that particular ride, that week lasted for about 2 months. It just seemed like I'd bitten off way more than I could chew, and I would never get to the end. The progress was so painfully slow, not helped by the fact that I thought I'd timed it quite well, because I went at sort of at the end of winter. It was like the end of March, so I thought, okay, there'll be some snow around, so I'll feel like it'll feel quite kind of Iron Curtain-y in that regard. But the day before, actually en route there, and when I was changing planes to go up to the very, very top of Norway, the flight was diverted because there'd been this massive snowstorm, and there was just feet and feet and feet of fresh snow everywhere. And at this stage, at the very top of Lapland, there's sometimes 80 kilometres in between kind of houses, let alone petrol stations or towns or anything. I was terrified. I remember when I wrote it up, I said, at one point I said, well, obviously in my usual slightly overblown way, it is no exaggeration to say that these were the most terrifying, hardest things I'd ever undertaken. I remember getting the manuscript back from my editor, and he sort of scribbled in the margin, "Really?" I was like, well, yeah, actually, yeah, really, honestly.
How did you get insurance? Did you tell them that you were going to take this bike, or did you just say, "Hey, I'm going for a cycle up in Finland"? Or is ignorance bliss when it comes to insurance?
Well, ignorance is bliss insofar as as soon as you say that, Andrew, I now feel deeply ashamed of this, but I've never ever had any insurance. Well, I suppose I probably have. I think there's something that comes up free with our bank account, but I'm fairly certain if I tried to make any claim that involved me having fallen off a 90-year-old bike coming down a hill and incapacitating myself, they would say, well, I'm sorry, Mr. Moore, that doesn't really fall within the remit of what you were covered for.
There's a good story when you arrive in what used to be the old DDR, and you go to in fact I think you take a detour to go to the original factory where it was built, and they give you a brand new bike. I think you explain because they think you can't afford a proper bike, so they give you a brand new bike. Just mention that.
That was they were really sweet. It was a lovely realization that this old, fully, DDR communist era bike factory where, I mean, they made it was the Mifa 900, my bike. So there was Mifa bike factory, and they made something like 3 million of them, which is, I mean, it's certainly, if you take China out of the equation, it was the most widely produced bike in the history of bikes, which is extraordinary. And I was so touched to discover that this factory was still there. And I did, as you say, made a bit of a detour, went there, and they were really nice. And they, well, apart from the fact that they clearly were not in any way interested or happy to discuss the old days, in other words, the communist era when this bike was made, they literally just completely blanked that whole issue out. But the guy who owned the whole plant, and I think he'd, it was clearly a struggling business, but he did obviously. I think he'd made his money producing fan belts. He was a bit of a, well, he looked like, I think I called him in the book, I called him something really rude, like Paddy Von Fan Belt, because he looked like Paddy Ashdown, and he made his millions in fan belts. Anyway, he'd taken it on, he had a real thing about old bikes, and he'd bought this whole massive bike factory and upgraded it all, and had this, it was really touching, and they had this little sort of photo shoot, and all the local papers came out, and old Paddy Von Fan Belt came out, and the big sort of finale was him presenting me with one of their brand new state-of-the-art, 9-speed aluminium folding bikes, and so I sat there. I just thought he wanted to take some sort of weird publicity thing, and I realised that he wanted me to have this bike, and it was very hard, bearing in mind that they, I don't speak any German, and even though some of them spoke a bit of English, without sounding rude, like, well, that's really kind, but that's really not the point. Having said that, if that had been the first week in Finland, I would have bitten his hand off, wouldn't I?
There's a nice nod to a chap called Colin Martin in the book. Now, he actually appeared on this podcast. Well, not him himself. Unfortunately, he actually died quite recently. But a chap who'd met him when he was cycling to Australia recorded a monologue, and it's really interesting. How did you find out about Colin Martin?
Well, when you're in the realm of researching very long distance rides on tiny wheel bicycles, his name looms large, because not many people have been stupid enough to do that, and he was a real trailblazer in that respect. I remember being really upset on his behalf that I think his bike got nicked right near the end, didn't it? He'd almost done it, and he was in Australia or somewhere, and it just got nicked. I just thought, oh my God, and that made me say, actually, just that.
But they found it.
Well, I think they did find it some years later, didn't they, or something? Yeah, which was So yeah, I mean, he was an inspiration, and so far I was like, well, okay, it is possible, and you can do it, but also just this, even though at least it was a Molten, wasn't it? So it was quite a nice bike, and my bike was a piece of crap. Let's be honest. I mean, it cost me €52, so no one in their right mind was going to nick it. But I just thought, oh my God, if they did, how awful would that be? Because every time I do go off on these things, there's always, I'm always quite amazed that I do actually manage to finish, me and the bike, generally speaking, in, not necessarily one piece, but not too many pieces. I thought, what if someone nicks this bike when I'm sort of 3 days from the end? So as the end approached, I started locking this like rubbish bike up with everything I had and never letting it out of my sight. And that was because of Colin, the cautionary tale of Colin's Molten.
Yeah, Brompton, I think they do make a touring version, or you can have a touring version of a Brompton now made, and I think they're increasingly popular. People do see the benefit of having a bike that you can fold up and stick on a train, rather than a big wheeled thing that is a bit more cumbersome.
Yeah, well, this bike, it did the job. I mean, again, I feel slightly ashamed of my stupidity that I hadn't made the very basic understanding of the principles of physics, that having really small wheels does make it quite hard to go very fast or very far in a day. And at some point, I think I was in the middle of Serbia on some broiled afternoon, I tried to work out how many actual pedal revolutions I'd done, and if I'd been on a real bike with actual size wheels, how many fewer I would have done, and it would have been much, much, much easier. So yeah, I mean, it carried all my stuff. I didn't really fall off it very often. It didn't break in half, so I mean, I can say now, having done it, well, I wouldn't sort of say yes, everyone should go on a really, really small wheel bike and go on a massive journey, but it's a real tribute to the very basic engineering that went into it. That it really was incredibly hardy, and nothing. The only things that did break on it were basically things that I'd tried to do to make it a bit better. I sort of changed the pedals, I think, and one of the pedals kept falling off. Did it? Anyway, there was the actual structure of the bike. Its brakes. I always, as I always do, I took like loads of spare brake blocks. I'm never going to find the brake blocks for these funny old, East German calipers. I barely wore them down.
Do you think it is now possible? Well, it's still possible, that's for sure. But do you think the publishers nowadays, they've kind of done away with the traditional style of travel writing? Your Bruce Chatwins, your Paul Theroux kind of writing. There always now seems to have to be a twist to what you're writing about, and you not only the strange bicycles, but the Rolls Royce, the Model T Ford, the donkey along the Camino de Santiago. I think the classic example was Tony Hawk's when he took a fridge round Ireland, and you think, wow, I feel it's almost a shame that, I don't know, I get the sense that those old style books are kind of dead in the water. Do you think that's a concern I should have?
Well, it's probably definitely a concern I should have. And I do feel exactly. I mean, you very pertinently point to round Ireland with a fridge, but there is no getting away from the fact that I have lent very heavily on props, really. And having a novelty, and it's not necessarily just because it makes puts you in slightly weirder situations or things that go wrong. It just makes it more interesting for me just to keep. I mean, I think I just obviously have a very low attention span or something.
What do you think the publishers would say if you went to them and said, right, I'd like to write a bike book about cycling, say, I don't know, across America on a modern day Pinarello bike or a modern day Koga touring bike. I've got one of those. It's a nice bike, but there's nothing special about it. There's no quirkiness to it. Do you think they'd say, "Oh no, clear off, Tim. Go and find a weird means of transport, please"?
Well, they'd probably say, "Go off, Tim, and try and become a slightly better writer with a slightly broader range of writing styles." So I think that's my problem, is that I'm just a bit silly and irresponsible and irreverent in my style, and I'd love to be able to write like Bruce Chatwin or Paul Theroux, but I'm just not good enough. So I have to rely on these like comedy props, and I mean, I can see actually, particularly in relation to my most recent book, Vuelta Skelter, that there was, just because of the nature of what I was writing about, because it was heavily to do with the Spanish Civil War. And my usual knockabout, idiot on a bike stuff seemed a little bit jarring, and it was certainly, from my perspective as a writer, it was quite a challenge to get the blend right in between. Well, there were all sorts of conflicting things that were going on, because it was the middle of the COVID sort of pandemic, so there were all these, it was that whole atmosphere was very strange and slightly sort of haunting, and lots of sort of empty streets and locked up hotels and so on. Obviously the Spanish Civil War, again, not funny, really not funny at all. And then bumbling oaf on bike. So it was getting the mix right was I think I did do it okay, but I can already tell by looking at some of the things that, I mean, it's done okay, and it's got some good reviews, and but I can see that people. So, well, what happened to all the silly stuff, Tim? What's all this? That's really depressing. What's really about the Spanish Civil War? I mean, for me, I just thought this was a period of history that I personally didn't know much about. I think because it was just before the Second World War, it's been vaguely swept under the carpet, and people just don't really quite realise it. And it just so happened that there was an obvious incentive for me, having done a book about the Tour de France and a book about the Giro d'Italia, that the other Grand Tour, which was the Vuelta, it doesn't have as much of a heritage and a richer history as the other events. And when I discovered the story of this 1941 race and this guy Julian Berendera, who won it, having spent a year and a half in Franco's concentration camps, I thought, wow, that is an incredible story, okay, well, I absolutely, if I'm going to write about the Vuelta, this is what I'm definitely going to have to do. So even though the subject matter is pretty grim and quite challenging, and not a usual fit with my standard fare, I'm going to have to try and make it work.
Yeah, I think the Spanish Civil War is an interesting one, isn't it, from the perspective of a non-Spaniard, because you're right, it was overshadowed by other things, and we've got certain connotations when we think of the Spanish War. We think of Franco, yeah, but we think of George Orwell and people like that. I went to Salamanca, and there was a fascinating museum in Salamanca, and I think that was the first time that actually I'd seen it from the perspective of the Spaniards, and it was a harrowing period of time.
Absolutely awful. I mean, I went through Salamanca as well, and that was sort of Franco central. That was where he had his military command. But I think one of the things that I found most compelling on that ride was that the whole story that I was telling was all about, I mean, not just the Civil War, but the dreadful, repressions and so on that happened in the years after it, and was the fact that even now, we're getting on for 100 years down the road, nobody, even young people, even people who were, minus 70 years old when it happened, people in their 20s and 30s in the bike shops that I would inevitably find myself going into to get things fixed, they just still do not want to talk about it. It's still too raw, still too painful, and I guess partly also because the Spanish are a very sort of family-oriented culture, and things that happen to their great-grandparents mean a lot more to them than things that might happen to my great-grandparents. And it's just, they just can't bear to talk about it. And it did make it, and I kind of almost gave up in the end, because I thought, well, clearly I'm just really upsetting these people by asking them questions that they don't want to answer. But that really did bring it home as to what a traumatic event it was for this entire country, and the extent that they still haven't got over it.
Do any of the other EuroVelos kind of thing attract your attention in terms of, hey, I wouldn't mind doing that particular route?
Well, I mean, the thing is, exactly, I'm very happy. It feels as if the world is a big place, and I should be thinking about going outside Europe for my next cycling type thing. But there's just so much stuff in Europe. I mean, any one of them, I'd happily do any of those, the EV routes. It's just the shame from my perspective, because, as we said, I'm not Bruce Chatwin or whatever. I will have to end up doing it backwards on a bloody tandem or something, or a unicycle on my head. But there's still so much. There's so much stuff, and Europe is just an absolutely fantastic place to ride bikes around. There's you can, within the space of a day. I mean, when I was driving that Model T Ford across America, which was an extraordinary experience, but there would be entire weeks where basically nothing changed. It was cornfields, and that was it. Just flat, nothing. In even on a bike, even on a really slow bike ridden by an old man like me, in Europe you can experience gigantic changes of scenery, culture, language, food, everything in the space of a day. I mean, I couldn't believe it when I was in Spain, and I went from, I guess it was sort of Rioja, but anyway, very classic, parched, rocky, boiling hot Spain, and then I went into the Basque Country, and it was just like a completely different country, totally different vibe. Everything's really green, and it's even the hours are different. I've been, one of the great banes of my life, as I'm sure you discovered when you were cycling around Spain, is that if you want to go somewhere and be given food, you might as well forget it until it's about 8:30 or 9 o'clock, because they just won't give it to you. And then I go into Vitoria-Gasteiz, or however you pronounce it, which is the capital of the Basque Country, having just come from the actual Spain, and everyone's, oh my God, I was cried with relief. It's 7 o'clock and they're eating food outside in a restaurant. Woohoo!
Have you got any more bike-related journeys kind of fermenting in your brain?
Well, I mean, I really do need to get something fermenting in there, because at the moment, there's sort of a 2-year kind of cycle, really. So when you're in between books, and a book comes out, and then the next year the cheapo paperback comes out, and then you do another book. So I'm now at the point in that cycle that I should be thinking about something else. I suppose because of COVID and stuff, somehow everything seems to be on hold. I completely, exactly, my whole sense of time has been distorted. And when I'm trying to think about things that happened last year, I think, was that last year or was that the year before? So as a result of that, as a knock-on effect, somehow my professional focus has been disturbed. So I haven't actually really given that any thought at all, which is really not a great answer, and I apologise.
How about a cycle in the UK?
Well, yeah, I mean, lots of people have. I mean, my personal opinion is that Land's End John O'Groats has been done to death in every single possible way imaginable. I mean, if it was just me for my own entertainment, I would certainly consider doing that. Yeah, I don't. There's something about. I don't know. Yeah, because it's like, I think it's just the UK is just too small. I need a broader canvas, Andrew, to work with. So there's lots and lots of bits of well, I don't know where. Come on, think of something. Obviously, there's clearly gigantic journeys. Maybe I should refresh myself with the EuroVelo map again and have a look at that.
How about all the way around the Mediterranean?
Well, that'd be nice. I'd enjoy that.
Because when I did the European bit, I did toy with the idea of going all the way around, but at the time, it was a lot dodgier than it is now. I think things have calmed down in North Africa, but that would make Paul Theroux did it, didn't he? The Pillars of Hercules.
That's right.
He went all the way around.
Yes.
But on a bike, perhaps you could get an Egyptian, and I'm sure the Egyptians make bikes.
That's a very appealing idea, and as you say, the North African bits would be challenging, but not necessarily suicidally irresponsible in the way that they might have been a few years ago.
Kind of one foot in Europe for half of it, 1 foot in another continent for the other bit.
Yeah, I also thought about doing various things to do with the Roman Empire and kind of various journeys that Romans have made and follow in their footsteps. I like a bit of that, and there's certainly, anyway, obviously North Africa, there's loads of that kind of stuff going on. Yeah, round the Med. I like it. That's good. I mean, that would probably involve going to about 35 countries as well, which is always fun. I might also get the only country this sounds ferociously boastful, but the only country I haven't been to in Europe is Albania, so I could tick that box as well.
Well, I can certainly recommend Albania. Just some steep roads. Well, steep roads, and when I was there, really poor quality roads and terrible drivers.
Yeah, well, I think we've all got the terrible driver stuff. I suppose that's the one thing about doing any cycling in London. Even though, as I said, I don't really do very much of it. Anything after that, you think all drivers are great. And I remember when I first went to France, like, my people in lorries respect me on a bike. I couldn't get over the way that people would give you space and would let you kind of just acknowledge you as a fellow road user. But maybe in Albania they don't, from what you're saying. I can imagine that. But yeah.
Okay, finally, we're actually sitting. You probably heard strange noises while we've been recording this, because we're sitting in a 1920s, 30s.
I think it might be 1949, Andrew.
1949, oh,
might
right.
be. Yeah,
Tube carriage at the London Transport Museum, which is full of buses. There is one bicycle here that we've found about a guy who used it for 79 years to cycle to and from work. It had flat tyres. It's in one corner. But how about a book? You could emulate Cliff Richard heading off around Europe on a double-decker bus.
Emulating Cliff Richard is not necessarily the something I was born to do. But
you could combine it with your Nul Point book. Visiting Eurovision places on a London bus.
It is a nice idea, actually. I do really like big old London buses. I have a fairly certain feeling if I tried to do that, knowing me, within about 94 miles, I'd have taken the top roof off under a railway bridge or something, the top deck.
Yeah.
But there is something. Yeah, I do like. Here we are sitting in this lovely old tube carriage, which, as before we started recording very wisely, rather than boring everyone to death, I was like dribbling on about my fond memories of sitting around in these old kind of carriages. And I do like an old Route Master bus. Yeah, I think you can get them for, you can pick them up for about 10 grand. Yeah, maybe the price of diesel isn't quite as appealing as maybe I'll get it converted to electric or something.
And you could stick plenty of bikes in the back and just do a few bike trips while you're en route.
It hangs together perfectly. I just need basically exactly. It seems to be the kind of book I would just need to have a really cracking title for, which you are now going to provide for me.
Well, presumably something involving Route Master, but there you go, master of the routes.
Route Master Flash. Yeah, no, it doesn't really work, does it?
Okay, right. Well, that's brilliant. That's fascinating stuff. I think you are an inspiration for many a person. I'm sure people have read your books and decided to head off probably on more sensible bikes on very long journeys. But thank you for that. It was very, very interesting. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Andrew.
And that was episode 46 of the Cycling Europe podcast. Thanks to Tim and the people at the London Transport Museum in Covent Garden for helping make this episode of the podcast a reality. If you'd like to get in touch with the podcast, you can do so by emailing podcast@cyclingeurope.org or by posting a message either on the website itself, cyclingeurope.org, or via social media where you'll find me at Cycling Europe. You can also find all the contact details at cyclingeurope.org/contact. If you've enjoyed listening to this episode of the podcast or any of the previous 45 episodes, please consider adding a rating or a review on your chosen podcast platform. You might also want to make a donation to help support the podcast and the website. Details as to how to do just that can be found by visiting cyclingeurope.org/support. And if you choose to help in that particular way, it would be much appreciated. Thank you. Join me again for episode 47 of the Cycling Europe podcast, when I'll be talking to a man who's going to spend the next 4 or 5 years cycling around the world. I'll be asking him how his planning is going. In the meantime, thanks for listening, keep pedalling, and happy cycling.